We can go ahead and get started. Thanks a lot for joining us today. I'm Nathan Dittenfoss, Director of Product here at Apollo, and we wanted to just take an opportunity to spend an hour with folks just talking about our product and where we are today, where we're going. I definitely want to try to leave room for questions as much as possible. I'm going to share some slides here. This is the right screen. There we go. Okay. Here's a Q&A box here in the Zoom. We'll mostly leave questions to the end, partially because I'm not actually able to see it. We do have a couple moderators on my side. So if you have an urgent question, do go ahead and post in there, but we'll save some time for questions at the end. We will set out a post-event survey, so please do that. And then I can't help, but since I have you here, do a plug for GraphQL Summit. It's actually going to be a 2-day event this year, where the first day is a summit targeted at individual developers, and the second day is targeted at issues of scale in the enterprise. Lots of great content in both of those. Definitely encourage signing up for that. There'll be several talks by Apollo folks, a lot of people from outside Apollo. A lot of it's just about GraphQL in general. Some of it is about scaling GraphQL. Lots of great content there. Definitely encourage you to check it out. So let me start by just level setting. I know that there's lots of different folks on the call. Some of you are probably really experienced with Apollo. Some of you might be new, completely new to Apollo. So I just wanted to level set and review kind of where Apollo is. We see ourselves as a full platform for delivering a Graph API. And we really break that into 3 major buckets. So runtime operations, we have our open source client and server. This is really where our company was born. We still have very much an open source DNA at our core. And those are by far, the most popular implementations and have been for a long time. We have full-time staff on both of these projects. We also then built, as part of our runtime, a system for launching observability and metrics. And then we also, for our enterprise customers, do provide field engineers who can help with a lot of that. We then also look at delivery automation. So at the heart of our cloud system is a registry, a schema registry. And the nice thing about that is with GraphQL, because the schema is so intrinsic to the system, because it's baked in, having a registry to track changes over time and have canonical state and be able to reason about the deltas across those changes. And then over time, the registry gives us a lot of opportunities to build other things like our checks feature. And what's really nice about this is because we can see the operations and the shapes of those operations that come to your runtime system, and we can see the changes of your schema over time, we can give you effectively automated tests for detecting breaking changes every single time you go to make a schema change. And then along with that, we can provide things like webhooks and a CLI to tie it all together and really sort of help you understand that full life cycle. And then the other big pillar here for us is developer productivity. So late last year, we launched our Explorer tool, which is a lot like sort of like other tools like Insomnia or Graphical Playground. And then along with that, a schema reference and changelog and sort of just the general things one needs to be able to interact with the graph, something you can give to your client developers, something that you can use to explore your graph. And then along with that, we have, just the SSO integration, the ability to assign roles so that you can give the right people on your team the right access. And then things like take the metrics data and expose versions of that to engineers so that you can do things like see the field timings in your queries and things like that. So I just want to give a really sort of brief overview of just our view of the platform. So at its base level, you start with a GraphQL server, and that GraphQL server is going to talk to your data sources, to underlying services. In some cases, people put GraphQL frontend in front of existing REST APIs and a client. And then what we've done is added to that a registry, and the registry then has these different tools for running the checks, giving you observability, giving you a history and changelog, and then a variety of tools underneath that, even where Workbench is our Visual Studio Code plugin for manipulating schemas. We have a CLI that we call Rover, which is a new CLI I'll be previewing here today. VS Code extensions that, again, allow you to tie in things like your metrics. And then what we see is that as people evolve their system, they inevitably want to go from a monolith to kind of a microservices architecture, really broadly speaking, but more importantly, bring many teams into the graph. And over time, what that leads to is what we think of as a federated graph, a world in which you can take these different services and have them all appear to the outside world, to your applications, as a single API. And then what we've done is taken that one step further, what we call managed federation, because we have the registry and because we can sort of manage the composition that way, over time, then what people can evolve to is a world in which each individual team can operate totally independently and then post their schemas into our cloud system, which goes through a whole composition pipeline, which then ends up in your gateway. And what you end up in the end is this evolution from single team building a graph to an entire organization standardizing around this federated system and everything in between. And we see different customers taking the opportunity on different parts of that. So let's talk about federation for a minute. We're super excited about it. I definitely want to get into some of the details. So right off the bat, you just get the general benefits of GraphQL, then extend into this world where you're going to have many different teams. And over time, what we see is that you go from your first team, your second team, your third team. We have customers with dozens of teams, each of which wants to be able to have an independent service. You want to give them a lot of independence, but what you don't want is what you had in the world of REST, which is just lots of different endpoints, and every application developer has to understand where to go for what. We want to give a common graph, one place that you can come and see the graph grow over time. It starts to have what almost are like network effects as it grows. The more that's in it, the more valuable it becomes. And the ability to take this decoupled approach, right? I can have my applications evolve relative to this graph interface, and I can have my services evolve however my teams are structured or whatever restructuring your organization wants to go through, or maybe a company gets bought and suddenly you have two different technologies. You don't want to have to expose your applications to that, and you don't want to have any kind of lockstep deployment. You want to be able to incrementally add anything to your common graph and move iteratively and then be polyglot. In other words, I want to be able to have many different implementations in my underlying services without having to have any of my application developers worry about that or have to go hunt and find the knowledge. They just want to have one single point. And that's at its core the reason why it's really powerful to have a common graph. But federation works because you can let teams operate independently. And then one of the beauties of it is, unlike, say, something like schema stitching, you don't end up with this kind of shared spaghetti code of a bunch of procedural code that has to know about the graph and that I have to worry about conflicts there. Federation is fully declarative. It uses the intrinsic metadata of GraphQL. And that's really nice. It means that you can have static validation of your composition. It means that you can have build time validation of whether you're going to break things. It means that you can know what the routing is going to be in advance. And that allows you to evolve over time. And so this kind of just is a very high-level example of what federation ends up looking like. You can see here in the user that I'm extending a type user with a key. And essentially, what I'm doing here is creating kind of a primary key effectively on an entity, meaning a type that is going to be shared. And then you can see here that I'm able to then extend from other services based on those keys. And that really gives you a lot of expressive power, but also not lots of just random code that is bespoke and has to be managed over time and where the knowledge of it disappears. You end up with this standard, and that's really nice. Excuse me. And then this kind of shows off that because you have this static representation of the composition, you can do things like render a query plan. And for those of you who do a lot of work with databases, it's a lot like explain in a database. And this kind of shows off that you can take the operation shape that you see in the middle panel here and then see how would I execute that. And the nice thing is you can do that fully statically based only on the shape of the composition. You don't actually have to have any runtime code. This allows you to debug things a lot easier. It allows you to profile sort of what the general shape of what's going to go on. It allows you to reason about changes over time, and that ends up being pretty powerful. Sorry, I'm losing my voice a little bit today. So I want to then get back to this sort of notion of the managed federation. So now that you sort of understand the general shape of how this works, some of the magic starts to kick in when we take those, what we would call a subgraph schema. So in other words, each independent team independently can go ahead and rev whatever they're going to do. And then they can use managed federation to be able to then run compositional checks and then run a full life cycle of how that will roll out to production. And it allows you to really sort of do things in the right order. It allows you to set up my service, have it all running, then say, hey, okay, here's the schema of my service. Now have that compose into my central common graph through the Apollo gateway, and then roll that out either in real time if you want to roll sort of a full kind of CD pipeline, or you can control that rollout if you want to. So that gives you determinism of composition, which is nice. It allows you to have very kind of strict CI/CD checks and also control over the total pipeline there. And then in managed composition, one of the benefits is if you want to, you can have sort of hot swappable configuration. You can have running gateways without having to roll your fleet and be able to automatically roll that out. So I just want to go here into just a little show and tell about a few different features. So a few things that we've shipped sort of, this is mostly in the last, say, 6 months. So as I said earlier, we got into developer tooling. The Apollo Studio Explorer I want to show off. DevGraphs is something we launched recently, which effectively allows you to connect that to your local environment. And then we have the schema docs and the changelog. And then over time, excuse me, the new configurability of schema checks is really powerful, and the schema change notifications and webhooks is also really powerful. And then the in our OSS, the client 3.0 line has been really nice to see. And the main benefit there is a lot of really strong caching. And then the enterprise implementation guide and the IDE for our workbench. So dev graphs, they are sandbox transient graphs in the Apollo registry. And they look kind of like this. So what you see over on the right, I think, is one of the cool features of Explorer, which is the table view. And then here what we're showing is a dev graph where I've pulled in the Rick and Morty graph, and you can see here the documentation for that. And then I want to talk about schema checks. Hey, sorry, folks. I'm, as I said, I was losing my voice, kind of running out of breath here. So here this is kind of a new view of our checks where we're showing that we can actually break out not just the operation checks as we've had in the past, but compositional checks. And then here I'm showing off the configuration of the checks. One of the cool things down below is the ability to exclude certain clients. So let's say you have an experimental client and it maybe just runs a few different operations that you don't really care about. You don't want to have to think of that as a breaking change in your CI/CD pipelines. You can now exclude those directly. In the middle here, we're showing the ability to, let's say you push to a staging variant, the ability to also include the production variants as part of your check. So I want to push to staging, but I want to say, check the actual operations I'm associating to my production variant and be able to use that at runtime. It gives you a lot of expressive control over what does and doesn't count as a breaking change. And we also last year introduced org level user roles, and then more recently introduced graph level roles, which allows you to do on a per graph basis an override, effectively allowing you to control sort of who has read-only access, who has production access. And so this just kind of shows off a couple screenshots. We actually have a couple different kinds of read-only access, one of which is the consumer role, which allows you to say, just give me the schema, as well as what we call an observer role, which also gives you access to metrics. And then we have contributors who are able to mutate the graph, and admins, and then org admins. So looking ahead a little bit, we'll continue to invest in federation. You'll see a lot of things in the UI, things in the expressiveness. These are some things that are going to go out pretty soon. Here we're introducing a new directive for adding contact information within a subgraph. And so here, this shows the subgraph schema where I'm taking a contact directive and allowing me to then show that. And then up at the top, you can actually see where that would show up in the UI. And then here you're seeing where you can actually browse the different subgraph schemas within a UI, and then even link to them from within my documentation. So here I'm looking at the documentation for, in this case, this is our graph. I see here that I have this field change summary. I can see which subgraph it's from, and the mouse over shows the contact information for that subgraph. So a few sort of big picture highlights. Obviously, federation and graph routing will continue to be. Those of you familiar with the Apollo Gateway, you'll see that we will start talking about this as a graph router. You'll hear us using that language more and more throughout the year. We also are focused a lot on various lifecycle improvements around how that schema rolls out to production. So people want things like manual gating, people want things like specialized checks, people want things like the ability to add auditing controls, or if they want to have segregation of duties and things like that. And generally the ability to pull that into sort of how you want your pipelines to function. And then policy and governance really will get at a few different kinds of things. People are interested in authorization in the gateway, demand control in the gateway, being able to do graph-specific control over sort of query cost and things like that. PII controls are just more general information governance controls. So the ability to, for instance, mark fields as PII, and therefore, you'll get to choose. So sometimes you might want to not let certain kinds of users have access to PII. Sometimes you might want to obscure the values of the fields in results in a centralized fashion. So just kind of run through a few of the specifics. So I mentioned consumer seats earlier. One of the cool things that we're going to be doing is bringing this read-only seat to both our free and our self-serve plans, as well as today they're in our enterprise plans. And then the really cool thing, and this is, I'm sort of oversharing a little preview, which is we're going to be giving those seats away. So you'll be able to get at effectively allow all the people in your organization to use this read-only seat without having to worry about getting more budget. Unrestricted graphs is sort of part of this also general trend, which is, and this is not a brand name, so I'm sort of oversharing a little. The premise here is we'll let you share a graph, or really a variant of a graph for those familiar with our registry. But effectively, I want to publish my schema and say, hey, I want to let anyone look at this thing. And in the short term, it'll be you'll log into Apollo Studio, and then if you've marked this as unrestricted, anyone can link to it, anyone can favorite it within their studio experience. This is really great if you're sharing with a partner network, or you don't want to have to worry about specific permissions in your organization, but you just want to sort of have a really widely available thing. And then over time, that will probably lead to us having what are effectively public graphs. We really are interested in, now that we have these great developer tools, how do we get those in front of more of your users? So that you can not have to worry about documentation, not have to worry about a changelog. That's nice. And that effectively will replace for a lot of people having to stand up and configure graphical inside their production environment, because we really see the benefit of not having to sort of always have all your documentation tied just to, well, use graphical and have fun, or set up some other external documentation. We really want to try to pull all of that together. In Federation, we're going to be moving to what we call static composition. So what this really means is, and this gets into some pretty esoteric details for some, but if you're familiar with today's gateway technology, the composition, the actual taking of subgraphs and making them all one thing happens inside the gateway. We want to pull that out. We want to give you a static artifact that you can version and reason about as something that you can put in your infrastructure. This is a lot nicer for the ability to control how things flow to production. For those of you who want to run immutable infrastructure, this will make it really nice to be able to have a single artifact that you can declare as a particular version of your system. So you'll see more of those changes roll out over the next several weeks. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but we are pretty excited about a new CLI that we're building. The first version of this will really be mostly a client effectively to the registry. One of the nice things about this is it's being built as a static binary. So for those doing CI/CD integrations, it will fit very neatly into your pipelines. You no longer have to sort of do a whole node stack just to be able to use our CLI. And then over time, you'll see us add a lot more functionality here. This will also be where you'll be able to run that composition step if you want to do that locally outside of Managed Federation. And then there's a hot topic for us, which is subscriptions in Federation. I definitely encourage those of you interested in this topic to watch a talk by one of our solution architects, Mandy. They will be talking about this at the upcoming summit on the 7th or maybe the 8th. And longer term, we will continue to invest in subscriptions in Federation. But this approach actually effectively sets up a specialized subscription service as a sidecar to your system, uses our registry webhooks to be able to keep them in sync. And what we're finding is that although the subscription semantics in GraphQL are very nice, that in practice and at scale, actually doing real-time data proves to be pretty tricky. And you don't always want all that subscription traffic running through your individual gateways. A lot of people like to run ephemeral gateways. A lot of people like to make sure that the overheads on their gateways are minimized so that the overall query traffic is really fast. And so what we see is that being able to separate the real-time traffic data actually ends up being pretty beneficial. Core scheme is something I'm going to just tease a little bit today because we're going to be talking a lot more about this. It's really just a way to solve the problem of how do you think about versioning directives? How do you think about name conflicts of directives? We want to build a lot of features coming up in the next days, months, years around GraphQL metadata. But it's as those of you who have been involved in this know, it's a little bit of just a if you'll forgive the phrase, Wild West when it comes to directives. Everyone has their own semantics. You then have to kind of bake those semantics deep into your systems. You have to make a lot of assumptions about those semantics. As people start to pull together federated graphs, as people start to pull together many graphs by different teams with different underlying infrastructures, we wanted a way to sort of think about directives in a more structured way. So this is just a very quick preview, but we're introducing this core directive where effectively you can declare a feature and declare a set of directives as a feature, give it a version, give it an alias if you need to solve any name conflicts local to your file, and then ultimately be able to use that as runtime configuration, as information for tooling. So for instance, people want to be able to put caching directives that maybe a client will use. People want to be able to do things that we want to then let you, for instance, reason about should those things flow through as part of my public expression of my API, right? Some directives are what we might call machinery, things that you actually are using for runtime configuration of like authorization, for instance, or demand control that you don't necessarily want to expose to your end users. Other things like cache directives, you actually do want to expose to your end users. And we want to give you a way to be able to express that. So why are we so excited about this? Again, we'll talk at length about this to some extent at our summit, but really we'll be talking a lot about this early summer. So I just want to kind of tease it today, plant the seed and start some conversations. So we again, our real goal here is if we're all going to use directives, we need to start having some way to talk about effectively packages of directives, versions of directives. I want to be able to not just have a bunch of random directives in a file and sort of not understand how they interrelate to each other, worry about, especially as we start to merge graphs and things like federation, name conflicts across them, or whether you're using like the flavor of the directive that we all agree that we should use so that semantics can match. And so it gives us this key primitive, this building block onto which we can start to declare, hey, I'm using this feature. Something like if we did a demand control feature, we'll probably express that as like a cost or a weight or effectively a price on a per field basis. Well, that needs to run alongside maybe an authorization directive that says, hey, here's the scope of these fields. And that might then need to run alongside a different set of directives that declare, hey, this is PII. And I need some way to sort of have all of those make sense together. So that's really a big part of why we're excited here. And there'll be a whole set of other smaller changes. We'll continue to make our performance of our runtimes stronger. We'll continue to solve some of the ergonomic challenges in federation. We'll make our Explorer tool more easy to integrate into, say, your OAuth systems. You'll see streamlining of our underlying Apollo server. You'll see client improvements to the registry around namespaces, and any number of smaller things that I won't get into today. And with that, I'm going to pause and see if we have questions. I'm going to pull up our Q&A here. So I'm going to just take this top to bottom unless our moderators object. So first question is the federated graph only meant for client backend communication or also for backend communication? I noticed in the diagrams that all the clients were either web or mobile clients, but does the federated graph also work well for communication between microservices? The main issue I see is that the tooling isn't really there yet for various backend languages. It is definitely a concern. I think I've seen both. We've definitely seen people use federation for backend to backend. In that pattern, though, what they end up doing is effectively coming back out through the gateway, which can be kind of expensive for depending on how your application works. We've definitely talked a fair amount about whether there should be some kind of effectively internal routing mechanism that would either be somehow lighter weight or maybe have like a gRPC interface, something like that. But it is today primarily designed to be kind of from back end to front end, because what we see is that at scale, most people already have some mechanism for thinking about like a gRPC interface for across services, and that they don't necessarily want to have to come back out through a whole GraphQL stack. But it's an active conversation that we do have with our users. Is it possible to share the slides? I think, yes, we will certainly have a recording of this for everyone who registered. I will leave it to our marketing team about whether they'll give you the slides separately, but you'll certainly be able to get access to a recording of this. Will we be able to run a check against all the variants? Okay, I want to update implementing services A schema against all variants. So the short answer is yes. That's the configuration I showed you in that screenshot earlier, where now for any given variant, so let's say in my staging variant, I say, when I run a check on staging, I want you to also check the operations of these other variants. There is not yet a sort of star, check all variants, but you can decide which variants you will also check the operations of. And in effect, for those of you not unfamiliar with this, what you're doing is you're saying, take the shape of the queries, the operations that have been observed in my system, hitting my server or my gateway, use those as checks, right? So that when I go to as tests, I say, hey, I've got this schema change. So we can say, if I were to run this schema with this set of operations, and I can sort of go through each of those operations as a test, will it break, right? Is there something missing? Like, did a field get removed, or did an enum value change, or something like that? And then we can tell you, hey, there will be this breaking change. And in our new system, the ability to configure that for the variants, the ability to configure which clients, what time range of those operations you want to use as a test. And then we also have a special feature where for each individual check, if say it breaks and you're like, no, actually that's fine, you can mark that particular one as passable, hit, rerun, and then you should be good to go. Also, are we getting better support for shared directives and enums similar to how you extend types? Yes, this is definitely on our roadmap. We want to make it much better ergonomics for how do I have some shared resources, sort of what we would call value types within Federation, meaning the things that are sets of enums or types that don't have keys, that are just really kind of the bits of data that you want to carry around. It's definitely one of the sort of things about Federation that people don't love, and we're aware of that. So yes, we'll have that. I don't have timing for you on that, but that's definitely a kind of, within the next several months, let's say. Is the graph router replacing the graph gateway nomenclature? I probably covered this after you answer this, but yes, in general, we will start talking about routing and a graph router, because we really think that's a more appropriate way to think about it. Part of this is that, there's already API gateways, they perform certain functions. We don't necessarily want to be compared directly to that. And we really think that kind of thinking about it as a graph router is a more sensible place to put it. In the near term, we've started to sort of effectively use it as a synonym. So the short answer to this question is yes. With this public-private graphs coming, will we have directives to help hide PII? So I covered that a little bit. That is definitely one of the features that we want to add. What is your suggested way to set up Apollo client to talk to 2 Apollo servers? So there's mechanisms to do this, mostly using the Apollo link. This is the edge of my technical expertise. I would definitely say to come into our Spectrum forum. We're also going to be launching a new forums over the next several weeks. This is exactly the kind of help that we would get there. I think there's also a fair amount of like Stack Overflow style content on that topic. Is Federation ready for Lambda and serverless applications? We definitely see people using this in the wild. It is on our list of things to improve, I would say, because it's not quite as out of the box experience as we would like. I would certainly encourage you to do some follow-up with us, because it's something that we're sort of interested in, and we definitely see increasing demand for. So it's very much on our radar, and it is something that we are looking really closely at. Again, we've seen people do this. They have made it work, but it does take a little bit of jiggering. We have found a strong want to pull in our current queries from Apollo Studio for things like continuous verification as a public Apollo graph anywhere on the roadmap. Great question. Very near and dear to my heart. I'll tell you, our CTO is also very interested in this. It is absolutely on the roadmap. I don't have a strong timing for it. Part of what we wanted to do with the Rover CLI is start to have a better surface area as effectively a sugaring of our existing API. But yes, we want the registry to be a platform you can trust. We want it to be the source of truth for where you think about putting your schema. And therefore, we absolutely want to increasingly have access for that. I will just say that several of our enterprise customers are already using our API with help from our solutions team. Obviously, it is there to use, although we don't yet sort of document and support it. And I'm very very aware of the irony of us as a GraphQL company not yet having a public GraphQL API. But yes, we very much are interested in making the registry API public. Will the new Rover CLI replace the existing Apollo CLI eventually? The short answer to this is yes. There are a couple caveats. The current Apollo CLI has some pretty specific client features. So the code gen that's in there is something that we probably won't port over to Rover. In fact, we have been collaborating a little bit with the Guild on their code gen, and you'll see probably us invest in that. I'm oversharing a little bit here for those of you here at the webinar. But most of the functions around how it interacts with the registry and how it does introspection will be in Rover, and you'll start to see that show up in our docs over the coming weeks. Can we do checks with a variant in two graphs? You can, but you have to run them as separate checks. We don't yet have a way to say, I want to run sort of a single check invocation, but against multiple graphs. But there's nothing that would stop you in your pipeline, like in your CI config, let's say, just saying check this schema against this graph and check this schema against this graph. If you're talking about just running against the two variants within a graph, then the conversation I had above around the configuration would apply here. Shall have support for other languages like Python. So yes, so there's a couple layers to this question. Is if you're running a server that's not Apollo server, if you're running, say, a Python server, or you're running GraphQL Java, absolutely use the registry. You can use checks. There's implementations for our schema reporting for Java. You can manually submit your schema with our CLI in your pipelines or from the command line if you want to, for any server. Dev graphs are available for any server that just uses introspection endpoints. So all of our dev tools are sort of designed to use totally agnostic to servers. The registry itself can be used by any servers, and we will continue to improve support here. There's not yet a native Python implementation of what we call schema reporting, which is the thing that will automatically report your schema from a running server. But there's nothing that stops you from using our CLI to make a graph, get your API key, publish your schema, and then from there use all of the different things. We are not probably going to have our own Python server. And today, to get the observability tools, like do the tracing, you'd have to do a little bit of extra work. There are implementations, and I know in Java, and I think in PHP, there might be one in Python, but I'm actually not totally sure. So our goal is to build mostly agnostic things relative to what your runtime systems are. Also, is conditional routing and federation supported, for example, on some condition that calls go either service A or B? The short answer is no, not yet. Mostly because the way we want to do routing is, again, really based on a declarative static model, and we don't yet have any sort of specialized semantics. Stepping back from the sort of specifics of conditional based on A or B, what we do want to do over time is give you more expressiveness for how you might effectively give hints to the query planner. So we've been experimenting with something that we've been calling detach, which effectively allows you to, for those of you sort of not familiar with the details, and I'm sure many of you are not, you can sort of think of it as, I get this operation. It has a bunch of arbitrary fields in it. I have this composed schema. It knows how to say, hey, resolve this field over here, and resolve this field over here, and resolve this field over here. And what the query planner does, it says, okay, look at the shape of this operation. Take the knowledge that I have of how the schema's bits should be routed, build a plan. And that plan sort of has to make some choices about, in essence, you could, to essentialize it, sort of simplify it too much, is a breadth first versus depth first strategy. Today, by default, what we effectively do is we try to minimize network hops. So if we know that we can go to, these 3 calls instead of these 5 calls to do this, we will choose the one that has 3. But some people want to be able to have a little more control there. They want to be able to decide at runtime based on directives. Again, not based on custom code, but based on the directives. I want to be able to, run these things in parallel. I don't mind that you're going to make a separate call, but I want to have them both go execute at the same time. That gets in, it's usually pretty specialized, but we do want to give you increasing control. We also do have things like the provides directive as part of federation. That what that lets you do is it lets you say, hey, I'm a subgraph. Let's say I already know like the user's email. You don't need to go out to the user service because for whatever reason I already have that here. I can say I provide email, which means that when I go to resolve in the query planner, I can say, oh, okay, well, that service should already be able to give me email. I don't need to go make this extra call. And so it provides is one of these current ability to do some amount of optimization, and we'll sort of add more over time there. Can we organize graphs in domains like customer, products, etc.? So there's an interesting and deep conversation to be had here. There's a couple different layers. So one is, yes, at the very least, you could just publish two graphs, right? That's sort of the most simple version. Within a federated graph, you could just have, your customer service and your product service, for instance, and you could even join across them and say, okay, well, these customers have bought these products, for instance. Or like the classic example we use is you have like products and reviews, let's say. So you have a product service and a review service. The review service has to reference the product ID, so it extends from there. And so in a federated graph, you can effectively have them as separate and then roll them up as one and use your own namespacing. One of the things that we want to do in the future, and if we have extra time, I could run through some of these things. We're thinking about something what we call graph contracts, and this is I'm oversharing a little bit here, but the ability to effectively express different subsets of a larger graph. Because what happens is, you want a common graph and you want to be able to reason about one common graph, but not all your clients need to see all of the graph. Or in some cases, you might, for instance, have partners and you might not want to promise them all of your graph, even though your internal teams are using it. So you might want to reason about a subset. You want to sort of create a filter and publish this special shape that says, hey, here's my sort of durable contract. That's another way that this could happen. And then finally, the ability to use metadata. So for instance, to sort of mark in some first class way, hey, here's the fields associated with this part of my domain, and here's the fields associated with this other part of my domain, and use that in various ways, maybe in tooling for highlighting, maybe to generate special docs, maybe to drive the ability to express these different contract shapes. So that I hope that answers your question. And that is actually the end of the questions. We do have a few minutes. Do people might want to get into some speculative stuff? I did bring some one more thing style slides here. Let me represent. One second. Okay, I did put sort of just for those of you coming to the webinar, I'm oversharing a little bit here, but I'm gonna go ahead and do it because that's how product rolls. So launch control is a general topic that we are sort of building a set of features to get back to that theme of the schema pipeline and the schema lifecycle. More ways to give you visibility and control over what launches when, what's running where, how do I reconcile, for instance. You can imagine in a really big federated graph, you get this sort of situation where lots of changes kind of flow in at arbitrary times. You want to sort of say, okay, well, did the composition work? Is everything good to go? Yes, I want to go ahead and say, I'm ready to launch this new shape. And that might happen many times an hour. That might happen every several days, depending on your team. So I want to be able to tee that up. Again, some people have things like segregation of duties, responsibilities, so they need some way to manage that. They also then want to be able to say, okay, well, I have, maybe dozens of nodes that are actually running my gateway. How do I do a rollout? How do I do a blue-green deploy? How do I sort of reason about the shape I want things to be in and some way to version that or reference it versus what's actually running? And so this is what launch control is going to be all about. Graph contracts I talked a little bit about. So this is really the ability to express these kind of subset shapes. This is something that we see a lot of interest in. And there's kind of two sides to this. One is how do I express the shapes? And the other is, well, how might I enforce those? Do I run several different gateways, each of which has its own authentication scheme? Do I have one gateway that somehow, like based on your authentication token, for instance, delivers you different graphs? Some people just want to publish different contracts for, say, my mobile teams. I just want to give them the subset of the graph they care about. Other people want to do like, I have a partner network and I need to not ever expose my internal field. So there's layers of needs there, and you'll see us roll out some things there. Authorization, again, using metadata to, for instance, assign some kind of scope to fields, and then based on at runtime the authentication information that you have in the header, you might want to abort an operation that is unauthorized on certain fields. You might want to nullify those fields and just not have them, end up in a query planner. Some people want like row level effectively control, where not just on a per field basis, but like individual items I want to control centrally at the routing layer, so that I can create a security regime that maybe doesn't trust all my teams. If I have dozens of teams, I want to have central control there. So there's a whole sort of layer of topics there. Demand control, this is something that always comes up in GraphQL, because you can't just do rate limiting the way you would with a REST endpoint, right? Where sort of each atomic request to a given REST endpoint is more or less fungible. With graphs, it's just, you have a sort of arbitrary shape hitting your infrastructure. I might want to do complexity analysis. I might want to do control based on, again, costing and weight. Our vision here is that you might want to say, well, take the tracing data that you already observe and effectively decorate my schema with weights based on that, and let me override special ones. And then there's a whole other layer where you might say, okay, well, I have this type that is really like a list, an array of some other type in my database. For some reason, that's either expensive for me or maybe really just valuable. And I want to keep track of effectively a ledger of, okay, this user is using this much, cost over time. And some people want to do that for throttling purposes. Some people want to like monetize their API and give you sort of a pool of credits that you can burn down over time based on sort of the imputed cost of the operation with different kinds of things. So there's a deep, loamy, rich set of things one could do here, but we're sort of interested in helping you solve the problem of, I want to control based on some kind of cost model of my queries, who gets to do what. I want to also protect my infrastructure. I might want to throttle people over time. So, as a user, I can only request so much costly stuff within some period. So that's the general shape here. GraphKit is kind of our code name internally. This probably won't be a brand name for, today we have those schema docs and the changelog. Well, we want to, we could add a README there. We could add a whole kind of documentation thing there. Those are things we get a lot of requests for, or some people want to annotate their changelog. There's different features that we could add there to make it nicer to have kind of a portal. Registry metadata, basically the ability to add, name value pairs to, say, a particular variant or a particular graph within the registry. I think there's some new questions rolling in here, so let's get to those. With launch control, is there any thought about enabling canary deploys of schema? Currently, a gateway is locked to one schema and rollback can be problematic. Yes, canaries are on our minds. Blue-green deploys are on our minds. How you sort of reason about the fleet rolling over is on our minds. We in general, the launch control is kind of a big umbrella topic for us for a series of features, but the general problem area is help you control how you want to roll out to production, how you want to report on that, have visibility in it, who gets to do it, how it's audited. So it's absolutely something on our minds. Whether or not we would model canaries as some kind of first-class thing is a separate question, but that's there. The other thing is, in managed federation, a gateway is not per se locked in that it can update dynamically, and we'll still allow that. And this is an interesting thing for us, because some people want effectively long-running gateways that can be, where you can mutate the shape. Some people actually want immutable infrastructure where once it's running, it's hermetically sealed until you kill it. And we want to solve for both. Our goal is to give you effectively a set of primitives and not be too opinionated about this, so that you can model however you want to model it. We've now worked with dozens and dozens of customers on this, and as you all know, you've got your special esoteric ways, and so we don't want to be in your way. We want to be an enabler around that. Next question is, can we have user control access at variant levels so that I can have different access for dev versus prod? Yeah, this is a popular request. It is definitely something we're looking at. The feature that we have today, which is useful for many cases here, is what we call protected variants. This is sort of like protected branches in GitHub, if you're familiar with that, With protected variants, you can say, okay, well, only admins, for instance, can push to this variant. So what people will do is I'll have a bunch of people, they all have write access to all my variants except for my main or my prod variant. And then I'll have a special process that can go and effectively promote to that. And that's, we don't yet have first class promote semantics, but you can easily kind of build that into your pipelines. But yeah, we definitely hear you that having more granular control down to the variant level would be useful. And then how can we implement authorization per entity at the operation level? So this is that sort of topic is what we'd like to do is give you a lot. What we've seen is a bunch of people invent effectively custom semantics through directives and then write a bunch of custom code in their gateway. And one of our goals is let's not make all of you have to reinvent the wheel here. There's some pretty familiar patterns that we think would get most people most of the way down the road to be able to describe some kind of scope and then use headers for the authentication level to be able to sort of then reason at runtime and say, okay, well, this operation by this user who has these permissions is asking for these fields that have these scopes. Can they do it? And then how should I behave? Should I abort the whole operation? Should I just nullify those fields? And that's in general the shape that we want to get to there. Any more? Oh, there's one more question. Question was, where can I get the recording? We will send out a link to all of the attendees after this. That is all of the content I came with today. And if there are more questions, now would be a great time to add them. I'll sort of stall here for a second to give you all a chance to do that. But in the absence of questions, I would love to thank everyone here for their time. It's really great for us to be able to talk to the field. We definitely encourage you to come talk to us. We have our public Spectrum. We are going to actually launch a discourse server to replace that because GitHub is retiring Spectrum, but that is a good place to come engage with us in the near term. We also, those of you who are customers and have an account team, definitely feel free to do follow-up questions through them. There are also a few ways to contact us on our website or, add us on Twitter. There's lots of different ways, but I would love to hear any feedback about things you're excited about here, things you hope to see that you didn't see. In our product organization, our primary goal is to help you change the economics of how you ship your graphs. We want all of you and your teams focused on your business. We want to give you the core tools, these basic building blocks for building a graph platform. So our questions are always, how can we take things off your plate? How can we not make companies build? So if you find yourself allocating people to build stuff that really is not part of your business, but just feels like tooling that you just wish existed, we love to hear about those kind of problems. We also love to hear creative uses of our existing stuff. And of course, we take complaints and, bugs, and there's a bunch of different ways to engage with us. So with that, I'm not seeing more questions roll in. So I think we can draw this to a close. Thanks again, everyone.